So here's the first task that we are going to do in this lab. The first task is we're going to create and configure Azure Active Directory users. And here's what we're going to achieve. We're going to create a new Azure Active Directory user with the name that you can see on the screen, and the user will have the role of user administrator in Azure AD. We're then going to create another user who does not have any privileged role in Azure AD, but is a system administrator by job title. So let's go ahead and do that now. So right now what I'll do is I'll head over to my Azure subscription, and I'll go, I'm already logged into the Azure portal here. I'll go over here to Azure Active Directory. And in Azure Active Directory, I'll go to create a new user once that's fully loaded. Directory, I'll go under users under the manage section. And I'll go ahead and click on new user. Now I'll select create user and I'll put in the name of the user there. I'll also just put the name there without completing the rest. So the rest are actually optional, they are not needed. So for this, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and just go ahead and create a temporary password for this user. And the role of the user will be user administrator like we saw earlier. So I'll go ahead and select user administrator. And I'll go ahead and select that for this user. And for the usage location, I'll go ahead and specify United Kingdom there. And for the job title, which is what we saw on the screen, and also when you're following the instruction, you'll be doing the same thing. I'll go ahead and specify Cloud Administrator as the job title. The department of the user will be IT, and every field, I'll leave the remaining field empty. So I'll go ahead and click on Create to create this new user. So once this user is created, I'll go ahead and log in as that user to test things out and also to use that user's permission to create another user. So here's what I'll do. I'll bring up a different browser. So I have Firefox over here. So I'll go ahead and bring up Firefox. And I'll go to the Azure portal. So I'll go to portal.azure.com on Firefox. And I'll go ahead and sign in with the user account that I created. So if you don't have the information about the user account, you can always go back to the user and you can copy the user principal name of that account. So you can copy it from here or you can copy it from here. So there are many places where you can find that information. So I'll copy that information and I'll put that in, and I'll go ahead and click on next. And for the password, I'll put in the initial password that I created for the user. And I'll click on sign in. And I'll need to change the password the first time. So I'll put in the initial password again. And I'll put in a new, more complex password. Oh, I need to modify that. And I'll go ahead and click sign in here. So if I go ahead and click yes to that, and now I'm signed into the Azure portal with the user account that I just created. So for some reason it's saying session expired here, so I'll go ahead and close that and I'll refresh the screen. So there's been some issues going on with the Azure portal more recently, so that may be related to that. So I'll go ahead and do the tour later. I'll go to Azure Active Directory. And because this user is a user administrator, which means the user has permission to be able to manage other users, I can use this account to create another user account, which is what I'll do here. So I'll go ahead and create another user account. I'll put the username there. So when you're following the instruction, you'll be doing the same thing, and I'll put the user name there also. For the password, I'll also specify a temporary password for this user. For the role, the user won't particularly have any privileged role, so I'll just leave the role as a user. For the usage location, I'll go ahead and specify United Kingdom. So usage location is needed to know the licensing and the license restrictions that should apply to the user. Now, for the job title of this user, it's going to be System Administrator. So if you're following the instruction, you'll see the same thing. And for the department, it's also going to be IT. So everything else I'll leave at the default value, and I'll go ahead and click on Create. So now that has created the other user account. So let's go review what we have now and then move over to the next task. So here's what we have. So we've done task 1. We've created these 2 user accounts. So in task number 2, we're going to create Azure AD groups with assigned and dynamic membership. So here's what we're going to be achieving here. I'm going to create a group which has dynamic user membership, and it's going to automatically add anyone that has the job title of Cloud Administrator into that group. I'm going to create another Azure AD group which also has dynamic user membership, and is going to automatically add any user that has the job title of System Administrators into that group. And finally, I'll create an Azure AD group which has an assigned membership type that I will leave empty for now. So let's go to do that. So back in the Azure portal, so the first thing that you want to do here is you want to switch over from the user that you're currently logged in as. So I'll just go back to my normal user account that has full global admin privileges. And if I go back to default directory, I want to ensure that I have some Azure AD premium licensing on here, because in order for us to be able to create dynamic groups in Azure AD, we need to have Azure AD premium at a minimum. So I do seem to have one here, so I think that should be sufficient for what I'm looking to do. So I'll go back on the default directory and I'll go ahead and click on groups. Now, one thing that I didn't show you, so my bad. So if I go back under licenses, in case you do not currently have Azure AD Premium enabled, whether as part of Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite or individual, you can go ahead and just click on try/buy, and then just go ahead and activate the free trial for either of these, and you get Azure AD Premium P2 free trial for 30 days. So for now, let me go back over here and let's go back to groups. And under group, I'll go ahead and create a new group. Now the name of my new group, I'll go ahead and call this IT Cloud Administrators. So group type will be security, group name will be IT Cloud Administrators. So group description, I'll just leave that as IT Cloud Administrators also. So for the membership type, I'll select dynamic user membership, and for the query, I'll click on add dynamic query. And for the add dynamic query section, I'll just go ahead and use the UI to edit that. So what I'll do here is I'll go to specify the property, and the property that I'm going to be using in this case is the user's job title. So if I go ahead and look for job title here, and I say if job title equals Cloud Administrator, so anyone that has the job title of Cloud Administrator is what this will apply to. Now, once I do that, you can see that it automatically configures the rule for me, and I can go ahead and save that. And if I go ahead and click on create, that's going to create that group. So in the same way, I'm going to create another dynamic user membership group, this time for the IT system administrator. So we're just going to do the same thing, just targeting a different job title. So for the group name, IT system administrators, same for group description, membership type, dynamic user. I'll go ahead and add my dynamic query. And for the property, I'll go ahead and select job title again. And for the operator, I'll go ahead and select equals, and I'll specify system administrator over here. So let's go ahead and do that. So if the job title equals system administrator, you get automatically added to this group. So I'll go ahead and click on create, and that's created those two groups. The final group that I'm going to create will be an assigned membership. So I'll go ahead and leave that as security. And this group will be IT administrators. And the group description, I'll leave that as the same. Membership type will be assigned, and I'll go ahead and just click on create. So it's currently empty, and now I've completed those 3 tasks. So let's go ahead to the presentation to see where we currently are. So we've done task number 1, and we've just done task number 2. So this is where we are. So in the next task, I'm going to create an Azure Active Directory tenant, which is separate from the default directory that I'm currently using. So here's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to create a new Azure AD tenant called Contoso Lab, and that's what we'll be doing for this task. So let's go ahead and do that. So if I go back to the Azure portal, and again, I'm still logged in with my global administrator account, I'll go ahead and click on Microsoft Azure here to go back to the home page, and I'll go ahead and create a resource. And once that's opened, I can go ahead and click on search for Active Directory. I'll search for Azure AD. Sometimes it's like you've got to know the name that you're looking for. So let's just look for Active Directory with Azure in front. So here we go. So search for Azure Active Directory, and you have Azure Active Directory over here. So if I go ahead and click on Azure Active Directory, and once that's fully opened, I'll go ahead and click on create, and I'll create an Azure Active Directory tenant. So the organization name, I'll call that Contoso Lab. For the initial domain name, I'll just call that Contoso Lab 2604. So you can call yours anything you want to call it. So, but you can see what that initial domain is. So I'll just make a note of that because we'll need that for later. So I'll copy that. I'll bring up a notepad document very quickly. So let's bring up notepad document. And I'll paste the information here. So for the new directory initial domain name that I'm creating. So for the region, I'll switch that over to United Kingdom. And I'll go ahead and click on create. And that's going to create this Azure AD tenant. So it may take a short while to create. So once it's finished creating, we can do the next task. So while this is creating, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to switch over to the presentation and introduce the final task for this lab to you. So we've completed the first 3 tasks of this lab, and it's time for us to do the final task. So in the final task, we're going to be managing Azure AD guest users. And here's what we're going to be doing. We're going to create a user in the new Azure AD tenant with the name that you can see on the screen with the job title of System Administrator. We'll then go back to our default directory and invite the user from our new directory as a guest user into our default directory. And after we've done that, we'll make this guest user a member of this assigned membership group in Azure AD. So we'll just make the user a member of the group. So that's what we're going to be doing in the final task of this lab. So I can see that the Azure Active Directory tenant has finished creating. So I'll go ahead and click here to manage it. And I'll go ahead and create the user that we want to work with in this case. So it's taking its time to open the portal. And if I go ahead and click on users over here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new user like we saw. So I'll go ahead and click on new user. and I'll leave that as create user. I'll specify name of the user. Now we're going to need this information when we want to invite the user. So I'll go ahead and copy that and put that in Notepad right now, because we're going to need that information when we want to invite the user. So for the name, I'll go ahead and put the same name there. And for the password, I'll go ahead and set an initial password. And I'll leave everything else at the default apart from the usage location and job title. So for the usage location, I'll specify United Kingdom again. And for the job title, I'll specify System Administrator. So I'll just copy and paste that in here. And let's get rid of that column. And for the department, I'll set that to IT, and I'll go ahead and click on Create. So now that's created this other user. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to switch back over to my other directory. And the way that I can do that is I can click on this link over here and I can switch back to my default directory. And back in my default directory, I will invite that new user as a guest user in my other directory. So these are topics that Sir Kofi and myself covered when we had a discussion on this particular topic. So if you're yet to check out that video, make sure you check it out for this lab to fully make sense to you. So for this, I'm going to go over to users, but this time around, I'm not going to be creating a user. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new guest user, which is I'm going to be inviting a user. And you can see that it automatically selected invite user. And the user that I'm going to invite, I'm going to put the name of that user in there. And for the email address, I'm just going to use this UPN that I copied from earlier for the user in the other Azure AD tenant. I'm going to put that in there. And we can specify personal message, but I'll leave everything else apart from usage location, which I'll set to United Kingdom. So actually, you know what, I'll also specify a different job title because that's part of our lab instruction. So for the job title, I'll specify Lab Administrator. So essentially, we're inviting the system administrator from the other Azure AD tenant as a lab administrator here, and the department will be IT. And I'll go ahead and specify invite. So now, if this were to be a production environment, an email goes out to the user accepts the invitation. And then what we can then begin to do is if I go back under groups here, I can begin to assign that user. So if I go to under the group that I created earlier, the lab administrators group, I can go ahead and go to under members, and under members I can go add member, and I'm going to look for that user account that we created earlier. So I've still got that information here, so I'll copy that and I'll paste that to look for the user, and there you go, that's our guest user. I'll select that. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. So ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this particular lab. So in this particular lab, you've completed 4 different tasks. You've created and configured Azure AD users. You've created Azure AD groups with assigned and dynamic membership. You've created an Azure AD tenant. And finally, you've created an Azure AD user in that new tenant and invited that user as a guest user and added that user to an assigned membership group. So thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next lesson or in the next topic.